This is the I Will Teach You a Language podcast, episode 168.
Welcome to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. Weekly motivation and language learning tips to help you become fluent in any language. Now, here's your host, Ollie Richards.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about Japanese and how I got started. How did I do it? What did I get wrong and what did I learn along the way? Very interesting question. And before we get to that, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the show who are, of course, iTalki. And without iTalki, I would have often had a lot of trouble keeping up my Japanese when I was living abroad in different countries. If you'd like to get a free lesson, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/free lesson. All right, let's hear from Danilo who asks today's question.
Hello, Oli. I got another question, and it's I wanted to know what is the first step that one has to take in order to learn Japanese. Now, should I buy a teach yourself or colloquial book or any language course, or should I take private lessons on iTalki or even more expensive ones with a teacher and in a class? Or what is the first thing to tackle such a tremendously different language as a German native speaker? Now, what is the best method, or basically what is the first step that you would recommend me? And I would also like to know what your first steps were when you were tackling Japanese. Okay, I'd love to hear this audio recording in the podcast and listen to your answer. Have a nice day. Greetings from Switzerland. Bye.
Okay, Danilo, thank you very much for your question. Now, I can talk about Japanese all day long, but I'm going to try and keep it to under 10 minutes. Let's see if I manage it. So, let me talk about my experience learning Japanese, because for me, Japanese has been by far the hardest language I've learned. Not because Japanese is necessarily the hardest language, but because at the time I didn't know what I was doing. I know that now, but I didn't at the time. It was actually my fifth foreign language, Japanese, but it was kind of the intersection between learning my first really hard language and also not knowing what I was doing, because I had learnt my other languages very naturally. So I thought actually Japanese would be quite easy for me, but it really wasn't. And I kind of I feel like I have a good perspective on that now, but I certainly didn't at the time. So I started learning Japanese the same way that I did with my other languages, which was basically language exchange. So I would sit down and I would ask my friends, like, okay, how do I say basic things? And they would tell me and I would learn it. So I kind of got this initial cool little boost, where I could say a few things in Japanese, and then I would practice these phrases whenever I met a Japanese person, and they would laugh and it would be funny and all that. But the thing is, it never got any easier. And I think the main thing that happened for me with Japanese is I really underestimated the foundation that I needed with Japanese, right? As a native English speaker, if I'm learning, say, French, there's so much I already know because languages come from similar roots. So much vocabulary I already have just by virtue of being a native English speaker. But with Japanese, it's a different story. There's so much that you just have to get your head around. And sometimes I give this one of my favorite quotes, and I say, you don't learn a language, you get used to it. Well, with Japanese, Japanese is the classic example of this. There's so much with Japanese that's totally different from what we're used to as European language speakers. With Japanese, you've got to get used to the grammar and the syntax, which is totally different. You've got to get used to expressing ideas in a different way. You've got to get used to different registers, speaking casually and speaking formally and kind of halfway in between. You've got to learn the Japanese script, and you do have to learn the script. You've got to learn totally new vocabulary, with the exception of English loanwords, which there are quite a lot of, actually. And then you've got endless rabbit holes. So like with Japanese, you'll kind of look a word up in the dictionary and you'll find like 6 options or 10 options, none of which seem to be exactly what you're looking for. Or else, the other way around, you're trying to learn kanji and you look up a kanji in the dictionary and there are like tons of different ways to pronounce it. And you can't actually use that kanji by itself, only with other kanji in combination. So basically, the level of complexity is really high. Now, if you are in an immersion environment, if you move to Japan and you live with Japanese people, then you can pick it up the natural way, right? But for anyone that's learning Japanese outside Japan, it's a big task. And, even for me living in Japan, it still was difficult. So I started with language exchanges in the UK, then I moved to Japan and I took lessons, I studied with books, and it took me a good 2 years to really get comfortable. And I made 2 big mistakes with myself. The first was that I never spent enough time speaking. I didn't spend enough time organizing like dedicated opportunities to speak Japanese. And probably more importantly, I never spent enough time listening. Now, I don't think it's my fault, the fact I didn't do those things, because those are the 2 things that are incredibly difficult. You have to try hard to find good people to speak to for more than 5 minutes at a time, right? And then with listening, most textbooks and things have tiny little dialogues that are intended to teach you something rather than to be general listening practice. So they are really hard things to do. And those are typically the mistakes that everybody makes. So I got there eventually, but it took me years to do it, of kind of fumbling around, of just gradually learning new words and building up my knowledge. But it really wasn't until I kind of reached breaking point and I said, right, I'm just going to do nothing but speak Japanese every day, that I finally cracked it. So here is what I would suggest you do, Danilo. If I was going to start again, this is exactly what I would do. At the beginning, I would not take lessons. Now, controversial maybe, the reason I would not take lessons is because Japanese teachers tend to be very structured in their approach. Okay, they're very, 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 very good, very, very competent, and they will teach you different elements of Japanese one by one. Now, the problem is that with Japanese, you can't take this bit by bit approach because there's just too much to learn. Right? So I would avoid having a teacher at the beginning. I'd get a teacher later, but at the beginning I would avoid using a teacher. And I would take one of the textbooks that you mentioned. There are lots of them. I'd just find one that you like. Go to a bookshop, look through a few different ones, find a beginner's textbook that you like, and I would go through it bit by bit, and just learn everything in there basically. Give yourself 2 or 3 months, go through 1 chapter a week, focus on the dialogues, do lots of listening, and just build up your foundation. Okay, this is the thing, I mentioned this before, with Japanese, you've got to give yourself the best possible foundation because there's just too much to learn, right? At the same time, I would learn hiragana and katakana immediately. You asked the question, do you need to learn to read Japanese? Yes, you do. Without a doubt. Like, romanization in Japanese doesn't work. It's horrible. It will hold you back. You don't need to learn kanji at the beginning, but you do need to learn hiragana first and katakana second. Okay? I'll give you some resources for that later. Once you've got through your textbook, I would look for a tutor on iTalki. And as you know, you can get a free lesson with them by going to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/free lesson. And I would go on a speaking binge. So I would try to speak Japanese at least 3 times a week for, half an hour or so, and focus on speaking as much as possible. But the order is important here. So first, go through your textbook and get that foundation. Second, focus on speaking as much as you can. The other thing that I would do at the same time is do as much listening as possible. You have to listen to tons of Japanese. And one of the big mistakes, like I said, that I made with Japanese and with other languages is not doing enough listening. I'm more and more convinced that listening is the ultimate skill. And I think you need to do as much of it as possible. The problem is finding material, because as a beginner or as a lower level learner, you've got to find material that you can actually... There's long enough to be useful, but also at the right level. As you know, I'm working on this project called Conversations, which is exactly that. It's listening material for lower level learners, but not ready yet, unfortunately. So I would, again, look at different resources on the internet. You've got quite a few different places where you can find Japanese material, but basically you want to be listening to as much as possible. So that's the plan. Okay, just to summarize again, don't get a teacher at the beginning. Find a good textbook and just knuckle down and work through it. Learn hiragana and katakana immediately, and then as soon as you feel comfortable, probably after a couple of months, start speaking intensively, like 3 or more speaking sessions a week. That's what I would do. So I hope that gives you some ideas, Danilo. Now, in terms of resources for this, there's a lot, but let me give you a few essential ones. There's one podcast episode you should listen to, episode 71, which is called Beginner Japanese Hacks. That's where I answered the similar question and in a slightly different way. You can listen to that by going to iwtyalanguage.com/episode 71. There are also I've got a lot of blog posts on the website about Japanese, but you might like to check out, in fact, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a list of all the useful blog posts in the show notes to this episode. So you can find all of that at iwtyalanguage.com/episode 168. And the last thing I mentioned is that, like I said, people always ask, like, do I have to learn hiragana? And the answer is yes, you do. Because it's not that hard. You've got to do a bit of work, but it's definitely, you can learn it quickly. And once you learn it, then you can use it for everything, okay? So learn hiragana at the beginning. And the best way to do that is actually with a course that I created with my friend Anthony. And we teach you to learn and memorize hiragana in 2 hours, which is fast, alright? It uses special memory techniques. And if you'd like to check that out, then you can go to iwtyalanguage.com/hiragana course. Hiragana course, which is HIRAGANA course. We don't have like a flashy sales page or anything for that. It's just it's like a passion project that we did, really. That shows you, I think there's about 10 videos in the course, and one by one we show you exactly how to learn hiragana. You'll have it memorized by the end. So I would do that. If I could wind the clock back 8 years, then I would take my own course that didn't exist yet. But that's what I'd do. Of course, you can just get a book and do it that way. Either way, make sure that you learn hiragana right at the beginning. Okay, so I hope that's helpful, Danilo. Again, a link to all of these things will be in the show notes. If you'd like to ask me a question for the podcast like Danilo did, you can go to iwtyalanguage.com/ask. And then as for today's resources, well, I've just given you a ton of them for Japanese blog posts, courses, all those things. So again, if you'd like to have a look at all of those, you can go to iwtyalanguage.com/episode 168. Thank you so much for listening. Domo arigatou gozaimasu. And I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.